you, Katerina. Fascinating conversation all around, each exploring a different angle of shared values and strategic financial approaches between the EU and the US.
Yes, between exploring the world's largest trade relationship, the role businesses play in fostering economic stability and success, and brainstorming how best to emerge successfully from this pandemic, one theme can emerge clearly. This is a mutually beneficial relationship. Neither the EU nor the US can fully grow out of this pandemic without collaboration in these areas. Simply put, they depend on each other to help each other rise out of times of strife.
Absolutely, Travis. That doesn't mean that everything is agreed upon. As you heard, there have been and will always be disagreements. But the major fact remains that when we take a step back, the EU and the US share the world's largest trade relationship and have always leaned on each other to facilitate economic success. This central theme is no more imperative to understand than in times like these.
And there are many other areas where collaboration remains of supreme interest, too. Up next, we are going to hear a dialogue about China. Before proceeding forward, however, we want to let you know that there has been a slight shift in the programming. After this conversation on China, we will touch on transatlantic security and defense before exploring how cities on both sides of the Atlantic are working to rebuild from the pandemic.
First, we have the pleasure of welcoming Stuart Lau, EU-China correspondent for Politico, who sits down with Laura Rosenberger, the Senior Director for China at the National Security Council, Dr. Antoine Bondas, Research Fellow and Director of the Taiwan Program at the Foundation Ar la Recherche Stratégique, and His Excellency Sadiq Karib, the Mayor of Prague.
Thank you very much. And everyone, a session on China, I think with relationship in terms of we're having a distinguished panel here from Washington, D.C., from Paris, and from Prague. We'll go straight to the White House since we have a special guest here with us. Laura, what is happening in the U.S. now? I know that visiting London and Brussels in just know that is G7 summit with a lot of mention about China with the European counterparts. So what is the White House going to do vis-a-vis cooperating with Europe on China?
Hi, Stuart. It's so great to be with you and with colleagues on this panel. I apologize. I was having a little bit of a hard time hearing your audio there. I don't know if others were having the same problem, but I did catch the tail end of your question there about our priorities in terms of working with Europe on China. So I will just pick up the ball and hope that I didn't miss too much there in transmission. But really great to be with all of you. And this is just such an important conversation for all of us to be having. I think the priority that the United States is placing on working with Europe on a wide range of issues that are the foundation of our shared interests, peace, prosperity, and values together has been on full display across the 100+ first days of the Biden administration. That's been very clear, of course, in particular in the area of China. We've seen Secretary Blinken in Europe several times, including just this week. Some really important statements coming out of his meetings with G7 counterparts, with others during his visit, I think are a real testament to the degree to which the United States and Europe share a number of concerns about China's behavior, whether that's its course of trade practices, whether that's its human rights abuses, whether that is some of the security challenges that we're facing in terms of cybersecurity, critical infrastructure in the technology space. But I think it's really imperative for the United States and Europe to work together, both to determine where our areas of shared interest are greatest and how we can maximize those. And as I heard a little bit at the tail end of the other panel, of course, we recognize that we're going to have some differences. As Secretary Blinken has made clear, this is not about the United States asking any of our allies to choose between the United States and China. But we do think that we need to figure out the best shared approaches that we can have together. I think the impact of some of that cooperative work was quite clear in the coordinated actions that the United States, Europe, the UK, Canada took to impose sanctions on Chinese officials and entities for gross human rights abuses in Xinjiang. And the, what I would characterize as an overreaction that we saw from Beijing in terms of its retaliatory response that took aim not just at government officials, but at academics, researchers, really impinging on academic freedom and freedom of the press in some significant ways. And so I think that, we saw there Beijing's strong reaction was actually, I think, mostly about the fact that it was surprised with that robust coordination between the United States and key European allies. I think that there's a lot of work for us to continue to build on there. Again, I know that we will, in certain areas have differences, but we as allies have always worked through those things together. And I think, when we look at some of President Biden's most important imperatives, he talked about this in his joint address, showing that democracy delivers. For him, this is very much about that. That is the defining challenge as he has laid it out. And the United States and Europe have done so much over the decades together to ensure robust democracy, not just in our own countries, but around the world. And I think that this is really a calling for us in this moment against the backdrop of COVID, against the backdrop of the economic challenges that we face, to really, reinvest in our democracies and in democratic values in the international system. So that was a long wind up there, but wanted to just kind of put a few things on the table at the top.
Thank you. And after 4 years of the Trump administration, of course, there's a lot of concern about, how sincere the US offer this time is. There's a lot of talk about strategic autonomy. And what I've been hearing here in Brussels is that, the US really does need to convince Europe on, for example, the unilateral actions that the US has been taking, open RAN, export control, steel tariffs. How are you going to convince your European partners that, what you're doing on China, what you're asking Europe to do on China is not just about US self-interest?
Well, I think it's a great question. And I think it's partly, again, about sort of going back to basics and reminding ourselves about what's at stake in this competition, right? There are, our alliance across the Atlantic is founded on shared values. And even where we have some of the differences that you laid out, and even when there's been unilateral actions by the Trump administration, I think that when we look at those shared values that so underpin everything we have done together, and then we map on top of that our other shared interests with one another, I think that it's quite clear that the United States and Europe have a significant interest in working together. But your question points to an important piece of this conversation, which is that I think sometimes when we talk about the US and Europe cooperating on China, that somehow gets framed in terms of simply an effort to counter China or to contain China. And you heard from Secretary Blinken, I think over the weekend, in some of his comments in his 60 Minutes interview, that's really, not what the United States is looking to do. I think, again, this comes back to showing that democracies deliver. I really love and think this is such an important point from the president, that this is about the US and Europe showing what we can do together, showing our affirmative approach to what an international rules-based system looks like for the 21st century. One that actually delivers for its people, one that continues to ensure peace, prosperity, stability, security around the world. I think that's on us. And I think, the United States certainly needs to show up and be able to demonstrate that we are partners in this. That's why, we very early on rejoined a number of international institutions, whether the Paris, climate agreement, whether the World Health Organization, right, the Human Rights Council, re-engaging on all those fronts is an important demonstration of that. But it also is, a big part of our China strategy is about investing at home, investing in our own sources of strength, and making sure that we show the United States is still able to deliver on our own promises for ourselves. And I think that is also partly about demonstrating to our allies that, our commitment is real.
Thank you. We'll be going back to Washington in just a moment, but for the time being, maybe we can take a look at the picture in the Czech Republic. So Mayor Hryb, there's been a lot of spotlight on the Czech Republic's relations with China over the last year. There was a parliamentary visit to Taiwan, and of course you were one of the members joining the trip. And then there were some sort of economic punitive measures imposed by Beijing. Could you tell us more about that experience and how you think about China's economic influence in Europe and how that is in turn influencing a lot of European politicians' decision making?
Yes, well, first of all, thank you for inviting me for this session. I have to say, first of all, I'm speaking as a mayor of Prague, so I have to focus on the role of the cities and regional leaders in relation to China. However, if we look at our experience, and I believe that although there are always some certain particular geo-cultural context, there is definitely a thing to share. There are definitely some general principles which could be applicable in other EU and US cities. And our experience is definitely that the China influence is a bit overrated or overestimated. Well, in case of Czech Republic, for example, there was a lot of strong words from the side of China. However, in the end, related to the visit of Miloš Vystrčil, the the president of the Senate, Czech Senate, and there was a lot of strong words. However, in the end, if you look at the result is that the China canceled an order of 11 pianos from Czech Republic. And those pianos were quickly bought by a sponsor, a cultural sponsor, and he gave them to the schools. So I don't really think that this was a great damage for Czech Republic. Maybe it was a bigger damage for China because they cannot enjoy the experience of Czech pianos. However, the really economical impact was seriously not strong. So there is really no reason to be servile to China and allow them to unilaterally dictate the rules. And I have to say, we definitely should have a new paradigm in approach towards China, which will be centered around fair partnership, human rights, and mutual adhering to the rules.
And just give us a sense about, being in Central Europe, and of course, on the one hand, you're a NATO member, but on the other hand, you also have platforms like the 17+1, where China is using to engage with Central and Eastern European countries. So you have strategic concerns on one hand, but also economic benefits on the other. Is it going to be more and more difficult for Central Europe to plan their strategic decisions in the future, given this US-China dynamics?
Well, I seriously do not believe that we have any economical benefits from the 17+1 or whatever initiatives with China. And what we do have to understand is that China is not a reliable business partner, specifically not in cases like the COVID crisis or any other. Because definitely, if you look at our experience, what they have done, as we just tried to renegotiate the partnership contract between Prague and Beijing, and they started to bully our orchestras, canceling the already arranged tours, refusing to fulfill the already signed contracts and so on. I think you have to see that there is a certain unreliability on their side, and the second thing is they take everything very, very politically. And that is really seriously not good. So I think we have to start to be less afraid about what will China say to our actions. And that's the first thing we have to agree on.
Well, thank you very much. And now we move to Paris and have a few words with our third guest, Dr. Antoine Bendas. And Dr. Bondas, give us a sense about how China thinks about Europe these days. I mean, of course, they're facing stiff competition with the US on the one hand, and they have the comprehensive agreement of investment with Europe on the other, but then the prospect of the deal is also not looking very certain, to say the least.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm very glad to be with you all today. I would say further that Beijing has made a major mistake over the last few years in overestimating its capacity to influence some European countries, and has also overestimated the dependence on some countries, especially in Eastern Europe, on China. And we all agree that there cannot be prosperity without security, and many European countries rightly consider as member of NATO or else that the United States security commitment to Europe remain the main guarantee and the main security guarantee we have. Yet Beijing still see Europe as a soft underbelly, if I may, of the West. And in this respect, welcome the emphasis that we've been doing on strategic autonomy, considering it actually as a means to neutralize Europe and weaken the transatlantic tie. But let us be very clear. We have differences with the United States. We are in competition in many economic areas, and we have even sometimes doubted about the defense of certain values by some US presidents. Yet, strengthening our strategic autonomy does not mean, of course, being equidistant or remaining neutral between Washington and Beijing. Europeans will always be closer to a perfectible democracy, what we always are, than a perfect autocracy. And that event today is even a symbol of that. I would add also that on many issues, the European Union might look as a very strange machine with very complex mechanisms, sometimes difficult to understand. But there is one thing that is very clear, that when the member states start moving, when they are aware of their common interests and the need to defend them all together, then you create a dynamic that is very hard to stop. And we've seen it on China. The joint strategy in 2019 is far from sufficient, but at least it is an essential step. The Europeans are not naive anymore. And once again, that dynamic has been de facto sped up by the COVID-19 pandemic, by the rise of the Sino-US tensions, etc. What is clear today that with the sanctions adopted by the European Union, by the announcement of a better protection of our markets, combining de facto openness and fairness, all of these aspects go in the right direction. Yet, I would perfectly agree with Meyer that there is still the need of a so-called European awakening, that Europe is not at the mercy of China, that we have considerable leverages that we must all agree to use. No, Europe is not dependent on China. There is a mutual interdependence, and Chinese companies have a vital need to access the world's largest markets. So we do have tools. What is very important from the European perspective and the European side is to be more self-confident and to have the political will to use the tools, to use the very many tools we have to, of course, defend our interests, promote cooperation with the US. And if I may, in very short mention, I would say that this is not, of course, against fighting China. This is not about criticizing the Chinese people. This is about opposing certain policies. And to be clear, it's very, very important also to state that this is not a so-called, I don't know, Western alliance against China, a united front against China, but it should be a coalition based on mutual interests, defending common values, and doing so in a very inclusive manner. And as such, to be clear, it's not only about Europe and the US, not only about European and North American countries, it's also about Asian, African, South American countries, etc.
And when, Senior Director Rosenberger was just telling us from the White House that there is strong common values between the US and the EU, and then more policies on China could be planned, if not implemented. Do you think that sort of thinking would have a large enough audience in Europe?
I think there could be an audience if some already existing initiatives are strengthened. That's the case basically for the Alliance for Multilateralism that was initiated by France and Germany a few years ago. That initiative should be developed, strengthened, and we should innovate in it, etc. I think it's also very, very important for the Europeans to be convinced that what we can do is to offer an alternative, especially to the developing countries. And we must make sure that in terms of infrastructures, in terms of models, etc. They don't have to rely on China. They can make a choice. They can have alternative between some Chinese proposal and some, let's say, European, Americans, and with our partners and allies in the region, offers an alternative. And I think this is something very, very important. There is also some sectors, some areas in which the European Union, of course, could do more, in which we could learn a lot from our partner, be it the United States, Japan, Australia. I'm thinking, for example, of military-civil fusion. That's something that is key today in China's national strategy that is maybe not taken enough into consideration in Europe, and we need to do more, because in terms of economic competition, in terms of national security, it does matter. And once again, we can work all together with our American, Japanese, Australian, Canadian partners, etc.
Well, thank you. If you just go back to the White House for the time being to get some, final thoughts. We have a few minutes left, or maybe a couple of points here. I mean, first of all, the EU-India summit is coming up. And of course, India is a strong partner of the United States in the Quad Security Alliance together. What do you expect to be the message from this upcoming EU-India summit from the White House's perspective?
Well, thanks, Stuart. I'll leave the messaging about the EU-India summit to the EU and India. But you're absolutely right to point to the important role that India plays as a partner for the United States. And let me sort of zoom out for 1 second here and pick up on something that Antoine said, that this is not just about the United States and Europe working on some of these issues together, but this is about partners around the world that share many of our interests and our values, and in some cases, some of our concerns about China's behavior. One of the first things that that President Biden did in his administration was to have a virtual Quad Leader Summit that was convening the United States, Japan, Australia, and India at the leaders level for the first time for a conversation about what these 4 democracies can do together. And they put out a statement with a number of really affirmative proposals, including on vaccine manufacturing, including on technology, including on climate, a number of really specific areas where they're working together. I know that the EU recently just developed its own Indo-Pacific strategy, which is, I think, another important piece here. And one of the things I think the United States is quite interested in is in deepening and seeing the deepening, really, of these relationships between Europe and the Indo-Pacific, between partners around the world. I think in many ways, the time of thinking about our partnerships and alliances simply in terms of geography is really a bit dated. And whether we're looking at supply chains or technology cooperation, or even on the economic front, there's a lot of things, a lot of opportunities for our partners and allies to be working together across geographic boundaries in new and different ways. And one of the things that the United States is trying to do is to actually help nurture and build out those kinds of relationships, those kinds of networks, because we think it is in all of our interests to be able to do so. So we welcome things like the EU-India Summit as a step or a marker along those lines, and we'd like to see it as being part of a broader strategy. If I could just add one last piece here, which is that you've mentioned a few times, Taiwan. And it's come up in both Antoine and the mayor's remarks a bit. And I think one piece here that's important is, we've also seen, increasing interest and attention from a number of European countries in terms of their own unofficial relations with Taiwan. I think the role of Taiwan, particularly in the technology sector, with semiconductors being such a critical element in our supply chains that underpins so much of our economy, so much of our technology. And the realization is there's been a global chip shortage of the critical role that Taiwan is playing here. I think is an opportunity for a number of countries to deepen those unofficial relationships, along with that broader deepening with the Indo-Pacific region.
And looking forward, what can we expect from more potential interaction between the United States and China. I mean, of course, we have the Alaska talks, and then Catherine Tai, the ambassador, also said that there was some kind of plan to meet with Vice Premier Liu He to talk about trade. Are we going to see more interaction between Beijing and Washington in the rest of this year?
Well, thanks, Stuart. Yeah, we've seen a number of high-level engagements already. The President Biden's phone call with President Xi. We saw, of course, Secretary Blinken had an early phone call with Yang Jiechi, and then, as you noted, the Anchorage meetings. There's been a number of other calls with counterparts in China at a variety of levels. Our lines of communication with Beijing are quite open, whether through our embassy here in Washington, through our embassy in Beijing. We have engagement with Chinese officials on a range of areas where we see potential to cooperate. Of course, Secretary Kerry visited Shanghai in the run-up to the Climate Leader Summit for a meeting with his counterpart, Xie Zhenhua. And they released a joint statement that memorialized some of the agreements that they made in that meeting. We certainly continue to follow up, whether it's on North Korea, whether it's on Iran, whether it's on Afghanistan, on some of these areas where we have a shared interest in working with Beijing. And I would certainly expect to see, as we go forward, continuing contact and communication at a range of levels. Look, we have a really big relationship with China, and it's important that even while we have concerns, that we have those open lines of communication. Honestly, that was one of the points that we sought to make clear in Anchorage, which is that we'll be candid in raising our concerns, but that doesn't mean we're not going to be engaging. We will engage China. We need to do so from that position of strength that we've spoken about here. But we certainly will anticipate continued engagement at a range of levels over the next year on the breadth of our relationship with China. The key for us is that those engagements be practical and they be results oriented. The question for us is always, what's our objective here? What are we trying to achieve? That needs to be sort of the orienting principle as we are engaging with our counterparts. We're not interested in just sort of dialogue for dialogue's sake, but we really want to see results. And that for us is the key. What's the best way to achieve that?
And I mean, if we are looking at European politics in the next 12 months, we are going to see elections in Germany. And then next year, there will be an election in France. France, by the way, will also take up the presidency of the Council of the EU. How are these dynamics being taken into account, just very briefly, in Washington? I mean, when it comes to forging some sort of consensus on China policy.
Absolutely. Well, we all have our politics in our countries, and certainly we have them here in the United States as well. One of the things that we've done extensively over the first 3+ months of the Biden administration is really intensive discussions with our European allies and partners. We've done a series of in-depth, what we've called virtual roadshows. The travel is still limited, of course, in COVID times, but we've had a range of sort of interagency conversations with key allies in a sort of virtual format to compare notes, not necessarily to reach agreements on what we're doing together, but to simply say, here's our assessment across the range of these issues. We want to hear your assessment. We want to understand and factor that into our thinking as we are developing out sort of the meat on the bones of our China strategy. It's really important for us to understand where our allies are at, how we can maximize our work together, and where we have more work to do. And so those intensive consultations, understanding the boundaries of debate, understanding where policymakers stand across a range of fronts, has been really important as we are formulating our own strategy. We look forward to having those conversations going forward as there are elections or other political markers in other countries. We certainly look forward to continuing those conversations and evolving our policy and our approach as necessary.
Thank you very much. And here we conclude our panel discussion on China, on transatlantic relationship vis-a-vis China. Thank you once again for Senior Director Rosenberger. Thank you once again to Mayor Hrib and to Dr. Bondas. And we'll pass our session back to the studio.
Thank you, Stuart. What we just heard in this discussion reminds me of what Fred Kemp stated in our introduction yesterday, that for Americans, the European Union will continue to be a partner of first resort as we all face rapid changes in a variety of global areas, China being one of them. China is a systemic rival for both the European Union and the United States. And while they have divergences in their policy approaches, the EU and the US are aligned in upholding democratic ideals, protecting fair trade practices, and promoting an ambitious climate agenda when engaging with China. The opportunities for transatlantic engagement span regions, sectors, and we have much more to come today and tomorrow in how we're stronger together through the EU-US Future Forum.
A friendly reminder that you can be a part of these conversations too on social media using the hashtag EUFF2021. And that registration for joining these events is still open. Just go to atlanticcouncil.org to download the Atlantic Council event app, where we have the latest agenda, speaker information, and updated info as well.